Welcome, Samira Shackle. We're here this evening to talk about Kirache Vice, life and death in a contested city. And Karachi is an extraordinary thing. It's one of the world's largest cities, but one that we know relatively little about because for some reason that we're going to explore in the course of the conversation, our attention's always focused somewhere else, which is extraordinary for a city of its size. My name's Dean Nelson, by the way. I was a foreign correspondent based in Delhi. I was the South Asia editor of the Telegraph, and before that, the Sunday Times. And I covered India and Pakistan and that region for about 10 years, from 2005 to 2015. And my work today means I still regularly go back and travel in Pakistan and India. And one of the things I just want to kick off with before, as a way of getting into the book, is one of the things that I did. I spent a year in 2015 regularly going back to Lahore and Islamabad to train journalists at a Pakistani newspaper, The Nation. And at the time, it had a very young owner who was 27. She'd inherited the newspaper, and she wanted to make it a professional newspaper. And we were training the staff. And a woman journalist came in with a great story one day about how people didn't have access to drugs. There was a massive drugs, medicines shortage at that period. And she interviewed a family that couldn't get drugs that their child needed to survive. And it was a really moving story, but it didn't have their names on the story, the people the parents of the child. And I said to her, where are the names of the parents? She said, I don't have the names. And I said, well, is that not important? And she said, no, they're not important. They're poor people. And it was shocking to me. I mean, it shouldn't have been shocking to me at that stage. I'd been reporting it a long time, but I hadn't had it explained to me like that these poor people didn't really matter. Their names didn't matter. It was what was important were their stories perhaps refracted through the voices of more powerful people. And so that's why this book is a sensational thing, I think, Samira, in that it gives voices to people whose voices we hardly ever hear. And we're going to come to that because in some ways, the book is a series of vignettes of stories told through those voices of people living in and around one of the world's most fascinating cities. But maybe let's kick off, first of all. Well, actually, I should say a bit about you. Samira's a journalist of a good few years standing now. You were born in the UK. You live in Tottenham in North London, a place close to my heart, and of a Pakistani mother and an English father, and going back to Pakistan for you was partly about discovering your own part of your own heritage. But maybe if you could talk to us a bit about how you came to write the book. What made you think that this was a story or a series of stories that you needed to tell?
Yeah, so as you say, I grew up in the UK. I've got Pakistani heritage, and I spent most of my life in the UK. But in my 20s, I started traveling to Pakistan more regularly, partly because I had a kind of professional interest, and I wanted to work abroad, and I was interested in Pakistan because I had this connection. And although I hadn't spent much time there growing up, I was very close with that side of my family, and it was very kind of culturally familiar and so on. And so I went there in 2011, I think, to Karachi, which is where my family mostly is, almost entirely actually. And that was, I think, a trip of a couple of weeks. And then I went back again about a year later, and I moved there. I'd quit my job. I was working at the New Statesman at the time. And I quit to go freelance, and I spent a year living in Pakistan. So the first 6 months I was in Karachi, and the second 6 months in Islamabad. And I moved back to London after that, but it kind of kept drawing me back, and not just Pakistan, but in particular Karachi. I think the 6 months I spent there in 2012, the security situation in the city was really bad. So there weren't really very many foreign journalists or foreigners there at all. And I was obviously in a kind of a sort of half foreigner, half not, I guess, because I was living in a family setup, but I was also, I didn't know my way around, and I was working for international organizations and so on. And I was very conscious of kind of trying to understand. And it's such a big place and such a complicated place that I felt I'd kind of barely scratched the surface. And I kept wanting to go back and kind of coming up with more story ideas and meeting more interesting people that would trigger more trips back and so on. And so the book kind of grew from the work that I did there over the last decade or so, really. So it kind of directly grew out of two pieces I wrote for The Guardian. One was a profile of a crime reporter in 2015, and then I profiled an ambulance driver a year later. And in the course of reporting those stories, which are kind of long form pieces, talking about how, just sort of telling the story of the city and the quite extraordinary levels of violence that they'd been there through these kind of closely reported stories of these people's lives, I noticed that there were real points of overlap. So although these two men didn't know each other, they came from quite different walks of life and so on, they'd both experienced some of the same big events. Like, for instance, they were both present when the airport was attacked in 2014. The ambulance driver was providing medical backup to the security forces, and the crime reporter was reporting on it for TV channels. And there are a few other things like that that just kind of got me thinking about how the kind of big forces that affect a place and these kind of seismic news events that we hear about can touch so many individual lives. And that was really where I started thinking about the book and what the other points of overlap were. And as you said at the outset, it's very much focused on ordinary people. So I think when we often hear about Kirache, it's in terms of terrorism or violence in some way. It's been the centre, just to kind of contextualise for people who might not know, it's been the centre of various different overlapping conflicts over the last, really since Pakistan's formation, but particularly the period I focus on is the last 10 to 20 years. Yeah. That's ethnic conflict and gang violence and terrorism and so on. And the book kind of tells those stories of those different conflicts through a very close focus on 5 ordinary people, sort of living their lives in and around it.
I think we'll talk all about each of those in turn, and I think we're going to have we're going to have a reading from 2 of those in the course of this hour. But what were your first impressions? Because obviously it loomed large for you in your own family, within your own family. But actually, I mean, one of the things many of my British Pakistani and British Indian friends, when I met who came out, who've been brought up in the UK and then gone out to discover that more of their family heritage, I've often found that they were quite shocked by it, what they found, and in some ways ended up feeling more British than they ever thought possible. But what were your memories of your first sort of few days in Karachi as an adult reporter, thinking I'm going to spend a lot of time here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I think about first impressions, I think about the first trip I made there in 2011. So before I moved there, and I'd gone with my mum, who also hadn't been back for 20 years. So we'd spent some time there when I was very little, but hadn't been back since, partly because our family there and so on would often come through London. So that was often the kind of meeting place for our family, was the UK where we lived anyway. And I remember my mum's disorientation, just because the pace of building had been so rapid. And so just for context, at the time of partition in 1947, Karachi was under 500,000 people, and today it's there's various estimates, but it's generally estimated at over 20 million. So it's been a really exponential rate of increase, really mad. And so we kind of went on a drive around with my aunt who we were staying with, and she was kind of pointing out places from childhood. And my mum was saying that can't be our school, because our school was on the seafront and there's loads of streets in front of this. And it was actually just there'd been so much building between the school building and where the seafront was that it just looked completely unrecognizable. So that really struck me.
Which part of Karachi was it? Was this
Clifton? This was in Clifton, yeah, right. In Clifton.
So this is maybe for our audience, maybe tell us a bit about Clifton. I mean, it's got a sort of particular image and
yeah, Clifton's Yeah, it's a kind of affluent part of the city. It's an old affluent part of the city. So Clifton and Defence, or DHA, which stands for Defence Housing Authority, kind of they sort of form a city within a city in a way, as many of the areas of Karachi do. But those are the kind of more elite areas, and they sort of think for people who live there might often have a kind of private supply of electricity and water and all of those things, which kind of mean they're insulated from some of the worst sort of day-to-day hassles of living in a big developing megacity where infrastructure is really lacking. And in Clifton in particular, and also in DHA, it's close to the sea. Karachi is a coastal city, so you do have these kind of beachfronts and so on, and nice restaurants and all of those things, and they've broadly been much less touched by the sort of violence and so on that I write about in the book.
Your journey really begins when you start stepping out of that sort of family safe space into the actual bigger, the sort of expanded, sprawling city.
Yeah, definitely, and that took me some time to be able to do, I think, just because particularly when I was living there in 2012, it really was so unsafe, and I didn't know my way around at all, and I was really kind of dependent on the relatives who I was living with, who obviously, I think if you live in a city that's constantly in a state of very high alert, and you are a wealthy person who might often be targeted because you're wealthy. I mean, at that point, kidnapping for ransom was extremely, extremely common. And that was something that most people, I think, in my family's circles would be conscious of. You know, it was really routine kind of gangland kidnappings for ransom, as it is in some other countries as well. Your sort of priorities and how you go about your day-to-day are quite different to those of a journalist who probably wants to go and go to the places that you spend a lot of time avoiding. So that was tricky to navigate, and it was kind of later really that I explored the city more. I think as time went on and I was going back in a more independent way, I was able to sort of explore different areas, and also partly because I just sort of was able to make my own safety judgments a bit better and had a network of contacts to facilitate traveling around the place.
And the book, I mean, the five people that you focus on, elegantly, I think, you know, you unfold their own narratives, and they gradually sort of intertwine as the sort of political, criminal, and governmental sort of forces kind of blur into a sort of malevolent sort of force, which we'll come to in a moment. But you've got five people: Safdar, the ambulance driver for the ED Foundation; Siraj, the map maker who helps people get the services they need in unregulated sort of sprawling developments. You've got Parveen, who we're going to hear from in a moment, who's a street school teacher. Zilly, the crime, is it Zilly or Zil, the crime reporter, the ambitious crime reporter, and Jana, a sort of bright young girl, straight A student at school, who in a small sort of Sindhi village, who eventually sort of marries and then sees her idyllic village kind of implode under the force of corrupt development. But maybe this is a good moment for you to kick off with a short reading from, I think you were going to read from Parveen's story first. Yeah. Before we do that, as we see that, I should say, and I should have done this earlier, we need to say thank you to Bailey Gifford for supporting this Wigtown Wednesday series, which has been a tremendous help. So yeah, I mean, if you, Samira, want to kick off with the first reading, and then we can explore some of that and then carry on.
Sure. So this is from the start of chapter 2, where Parveen is being introduced, and she is a young woman who she lives in Liari, which is an area that one of the areas of Karachi that did make it into the international press a bit, because it was the real centre of a gang war, and it was sort of effectively run by organised criminals for a long period. But this is just sort of introducing the area and introducing Parveen and her work. They called it a slum, but Liari was Parveen's home in all its overcrowded glory. The area was as old as Karachi, not like the newer settlements that had sprung up on the periphery of the city as the population expanded. The history was there in the architecture, the tall and majestic old apartment blocks of a bygone era, painted in pastel colours with ornate but depleted plasterwork, like ageing aristocrats who had fallen on hard times. They stood cheek by jowl with squat concrete buildings crammed in to accommodate a swelling populace, structures so close together that there seemed to be no gap between them at all. Some were topped with rusting corrugated iron sheets held down crudely with bricks on each corner, others with half-finished plaster, the metal webbing still visible, as if the buildings had been caught in a state of undress. Throughout her teenage years, Parveen had seen street schools. One in particular stuck in her mind, the place she had spotted as she walked between two relatives' homes in the late 1990s. It seemed like a small oasis of order in an otherwise chaotic place. Students of all ages were squatting on a rug laid out on the street, squinting at the chalkboard through the afternoon sunlight and the clouds of dust kicked up by auto rickshaws and motorbikes speeding past. The demarcations of the school were daubed onto the wall of the building behind it in paint, a crudely strung up curtain on each side giving the impression, if not the actuality, of privacy. People crossed over the road to walk on the other side so as not to interrupt the lessons. In one form or another, street schools had been running in Liari since the 1960s, free open-air teaching set up by the community to counteract endemic government neglect. Some kids were sent there to augment the teaching they got at underfunded government schools, or because their parents wanted to keep them occupied and away from drug dealers. Others, older teenagers, a few adults, had jobs as day labourers or in factories. Liari was a poor area. Many people dropped out of school to work, only to find later that their career prospects were limited by illiteracy. Parveen, who had always wanted to do something for her people, knew she had to find out more. In 2001, when Parveen was 19 and had only just finished her own education, she got a teaching job. Although they called it a street school, the establishment on Liari's Shahbeg Lane, where she worked, sat on top of a building a few stories high, hemmed in by low perimeter walls and wooden boards painted bright green. From up here, you could see the familiar higgledy-piggledy buildings of Liari stretching out on all sides. The school taught Urdu reading and writing, basic English and maths. Parveen loved teaching and finding out about her students' lives, but she also loved organising, and within a year she was involved in the day-to-day management of the school. Sometimes she and another teacher would take an auto rickshaw out of the area, through the warren of congested alleys and under the cartoonish yellow arches that shouted, "Welcome to Liari town," in English and Urdu. From here, the city opened out onto a wide freeway, a vast expanse of tarmac and cars, and they'd ride all the way to Urdu Bazaar, a hectic cluster of stalls and shops selling books and stationery on Muhammad Ali Jinnah Road. Here they would seek out the second-hand stalls that stocked battered textbooks, sometimes with pages missing or scrawls in the margins, whatever they could find to supplement their teaching.
Thank you for that, Samira. If you didn't see it when she lifted up, let's have another quick look at the book, because given how interested you all are in Pakistan, by the fact you're here, you really do need to buy this. But I think in a way, I mean, Parveen's story is a really strong one, and she's a woman, acting, in a very poor neighbourhood. She's trying to assert herself, trying to sort of have agency and to live her own life, both socially, as in terms of as a single woman, in terms of the work that she's doing. She's a character, a kind of force of nature, I think you describe her as, and yet all around her there are forces shaping what she can and can't do, where she can and can't go, what she can be if she wants to, and possibly even who she can love. I mean, can you sort of just tell us a bit more about her story as it unfolds? Because I think in all of these characters there's something, there are bits of all of the story. They're all living through the same period. They're all experiencing these hugely, these seismic events refracted through the different circumstances of their lives. So tell us a bit more about how Parveen's story develops.
Yeah, so she's, as I said, she's from Liari, as you heard there. and she wasn't from a particularly well-off family. It's not a well-off area. It's a very kind of marginalized area. It's often it's generally described as a slum, and it's a very historic area as well, as should have come across in that reading I did. And it's because it's where it's situated, so it's quite central in Karachi, unlike some of the newer slums, but it's quite near the port, so it's been a center of the drugs trade. There's a lot of heroin that comes in via Afghanistan, and so on. And so it's long been a kind of center of organized crime. And during Parveen's life, she grew up there. In her sort of teens, the area was in a kind of truce between these different gangsters, and she was able to sort of go about her life with her siblings and her family and so on. And she sort of developed in that period. Just her personality is that she's someone who really stands up against injustice. I write about this in the book, that her family, her parents were not particularly educated, but when they got her older brother married off to a very young girl till she was in her teens, Parveen, who was only 16 or so herself at the time, took a stand and said that if anyone else, any other girls in the family were married too young, then she would report them to the police herself, which is quite an outrageous thing to say in the context where that's just really such a social norm. And
she said she'd report her grandmother first.
She told her grandmother she'd report her first, because her grandmother had really driven it. And she did actually, she succeeded in effecting a change in her family. So I think that tells you something about she's got a real kind of strength of character and felt very strongly about the way that women were treated, and really kind of, she had an uncle who gave her lots of books from Marx and Engels and all these thinkers, and books about women's health and so on. And so as a teenager, she really sort of became very political. And that meant that later, when there was a kind of rift between the gangsters and that truce was broken, and the area was really consumed by fighting between different gangsters, to the extent that, she wasn't able to get to and from school, or then her workplace, the street school, which I just described, ended up being shut down. It was really it's a very kind of tightly packed and densely populated area, but it became kind of impossible to just go between areas. So if where she lived was controlled by one set of gangsters, it'd be very difficult to cross over into another area where maybe her cousins lived or whatever. And in that period, which then lasted for a pretty prolonged period, lots of people made compromises, as you do when you live in an area like that. You sort of make moral compromises to get by and to do what you need to do. So that might be joining a gang, it might be collaborating with a gang. Sometimes it's very intimate. Lots of people, most people in the area know someone who's been killed or who's joined a gang for protection or whatever it is. And particularly later, when she stopped working at the street school, she was working in sort of charity and local development and activism. And lots of people in that kind of social work sector ended up working with the dominant gang, sort of taking money from the gang who had an interest in doing this, so that they would sort of curry favor with local people. And lots of social workers and charity workers made the judgment that it was better to get the work done, and sort of pragmatic argument for compromising in this way. And Parveen really never did. She kind of really stuck to her guns, often at great personal danger, kind of bringing her into conflict with the very top gangsters, which she sort of found herself unable to stop herself from giving this incredibly powerful, very dangerous man a piece of her mind when she met him. And as a result, had to lie low for quite a while. And so she really just never, even as people around her were sort of sucked into this vortex of criminality, she never wavered from that sort of moral course.
I want to come back to her at the end, because I think that issue of how everybody adjusts to the reality of raw corrupt power as it sort of moves closer in on them is a sort of recurring theme throughout all of the characters' stories. But you're talking about organised crime on the streets of Liari, and then we've got this story of Zilli, the crime reporter, whose success is bound to it. He thrives on the gang wars. He's reporting with his television crew live from assassinations of gangsters, assassinations of politicians, bomb explosions, and all of that all of that conflict sort of makes him prominent and successful, but at the same time hems him in. I mean, each one of these characters is confronted by the limits of their own agency and what they can and can't do at a certain point. Tell us about Zilly and I suppose that the limits that he the boundaries that he is confronted by are political as well as criminal at a certain point, that where those two things are blurred. So it'd be good to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, as you say, he's a crime reporter for TV, and crime reporting in Karachi is such a kind of broad remit, because it's not just organised crime; it's also terrorism, and lots of criminal gangs are so intimately tied to politics that it's quite a political job as well. And he is, he's a really interesting guy. I've known him now since 2015, when I first wrote about crime reporters. And he's so used to, I write about this in the book, he's so used to kind of, because it's such a high stakes and such a dangerous job, he was so used to sort of just having to be a bit shifty about things, not giving away too many details, that it was really difficult to even pin him down to give me his age, for instance. And bearing in mind, I've now known the guy for 6 years. He just sort of changes his answer on things all the time, which is, I think, born of safety. He's so in the habit of changing his vehicles and not sharing any details that might jeopardize him somehow, that it's almost like a compulsion. But yeah, he was reporting on all this stuff while Karachi was in this sort of convulsion of violence. And it's a kind of strange thing, because I think his career success is very intimately tied to, I mean, as this is probably true for all journalists to an extent, but I think it's particularly marked in someone in that kind of job and in that kind of place. His success is sort of tied to these terrible things happening and getting the most access and being the closest proximity to the danger. And it's quite
and knowing the gangsters
and knowing exactly,
people.
Yeah, quite ethically fraught, because kind of having contacts with not just law enforcement but gangsters too, and really unsavory people. And a lot of these gangsters, like Uzair Baloch, who was running Liari, where Parveen lived, sort of, he fancied himself as a bit of a politician, and had, he would hold press conferences and had an almost kind of PR wing in his gang, as it were. So it's a complicated context, but he definitely, I think some crime reporters maybe have more qualms about who they keep up contacts with, but Zilly really is very focused on sort of getting the story, bringing him into a lot of danger. I mean, I write in the book about how he was, his reporting on police encounters, they're called, just kind of euphemism for extrajudicial killings against militant groups, extremist groups, after a big sort of police and army-led crackdown began in 2014. He was reporting quite positively on these police encounters, and that ended up putting him on a Taliban hit list. And so that really kind of constrained his life hugely after that.
We should probably explain that a bit, because I think when we know the region like we do, we sort of trip over these things as if everybody knows exactly what they are. And I think the encounter killing probably deserves to be spelled out in a little bit more detail, because my understanding, I think Karachi invented the encounter killing, and it was exported into India and has become rife throughout the region. Where, as I understand it, I mean, if your understanding is different, let us know. Is that the police often will capture a suspect and then release them in circumstances, release in inverted quotes, where they're going to shoot them dead, and then pretend that it was a shootout, that they'd escaped, got a gun, shot at them. But essentially, it's a targeted assassination.
Yeah, more or less. I would understand it in the same way. I think they don't always bring them into custody or anything first. Like a lot of the ones that Zilly was reporting on, they're literally just turning up at the house of where suspected militant or whatever gangster is, and they're just sort of going in and shooting. But as you say, it's sort of the idea of it being an encounter is sort of that they'll say it was a shootout and they were acting in self-defense, but it's very explicit what the aim is. And it's quite extraordinary, actually. Zilly wasn't the only reporter doing this, but they, during the crackdown, which I write about in the book, which began in 2014, I mean, police were like taking camera crews with them, and the camera crews would wait outside. They wouldn't like go in and film the actual shooting, but they'd be outside with you'd hear the gunshots going off, and that's like literally police going in and killing people. And the police do that because they're making the calculation that that's going to be good for them. While I was first reporting on. It's extraordinary. Yeah, while I was reporting on Crime Reporters in 2015, I got added to this WhatsApp group for Karachi crime reporters, and every day, because the reporters would be outside filming, like broadcasting live with their camera crews, but then after they're off air, they go in and they take photos of the dead to identify them. And I was on and they always happen at night, pretty much, the encounters. I was on this horrible WhatsApp group of crime reporters where it would just be like photos of just like close-ups of dead bodies, basically, all sort of being sent round and circulated from the encounter that they'd been out on the night before. So people like completely desensitized to it. The level of violence that you're constantly seeing in that job is really mind-blowing.
And in this particular, I mean, impunity is one of the things that really kind of shouts out from the throughout the book, but certainly in the chapter on Zilly, where you report that at one stage he gets tipped off by a policeman to be at a certain place at a certain time where he can actually film the encounter happening. So the police officer is saying to him, "We're going to carry out an illegal assassination, and you can come along and film it, and that's going to be great for you." Tell us about. I mean, to a lot. I think to a lot of the people here in the audience, that will be knowing about British policing or policing in the West, which far from perfect, but I think that will come quite as quite a shock.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I mean, this was during the peak of the Karachi operation, as they call it, which started in 2014, 2015. I mean, this was like nightly on TV. It was a big broadcast winner. So you'd have the camera crew and journalists standing outside the door, and you can hear the gunshots going off. I mean, there's footage of lots of these news clips on YouTube. It's really extraordinary. And yeah, as you say, there are also examples with specific prominent gangsters and so on, where a police officer would decide Zilly was the chosen journalist for that and call him and tip him off. So yeah, it's an extraordinary level of impunity, and it's I've seen it in action, actually. I've spent time in some police stations in Karachi during the sort of peak of the operation around 2015, and like the openness with which police talk about it is really surprising. There's not really any, even although they use this phrase encounter, there isn't much sense of there's no kind of real hiding what it is.
And in this particular encounter, it's not any old encounter, is it? It's the biggest gangster in the city, isn't it, that he's getting called to?
Yeah, this was his big break in, or what he describes as his big break in 2008. Sorry, which was Rehman Dakate, who was when I mentioned the sort of truce that had been over Liari, that was Rehman Dakate was sort of running the show, and the police sort of decided they'd had enough, sort of police and politicians and so on decided they'd had enough, and they killed him, and that was. Zilly was sort of chosen to go and report on it. It was after he'd been killed that he turned up, and he sort of credits that as being his big break as a crime reporter.
I mean, I think it was an extraordinary story, and not least because it highlighted the impunity on both sides. That you mentioned, I think, that he'd been photographed barely a year or two before in a car with Benazir Bhutto before she was assassinated, obviously, and. So this wasn't any old gang. It was the kingpin, but he was the kingpin who had access and relationships with power at the very top of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the really interesting thing in Karachi, is that so many of these gangsters and criminals are so intimately tied into politics. So the Liari gangs are very closely allied generally with the Pakistan People's Party, which is Benazir Bhutto's party. There's other street gangs which kind of act quite directly as sort of militias almost for political parties. The MQM is the big sort of Karachi party who I write about in the book, and they've got lots of they're sort of local branches of the MQM which effectively operate in much the same way as the Liari gangsters do, but they're also sort of enforcing the party's writ in certain areas, and even down to sort of voter suppression or voter mobilization and so on, through, you know, literally men with guns telling you you're going to get out and vote now. So yeah, it's a very kind of intimately tied in together. I should say that it's brutal as the crackdown was, it has been sort of at least temporarily effective in reducing the number of violence, and that those kind of the operation of those street gangs and street militias. So it's sort of, a lot of that's not so active now, but I do sort of question how effective that is, and how effectively you can really root out that sort of organised crime when it's so intimately connected to the highest echelons of politics. And as you say, that makes impunity a very troublesome question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the criminality, the sort of overlap between organised crime and politics. You know, when you talk about Zilly going into a prison and you know, about a fight between rival foot soldiers, they were gangsters that were allied with political parties, and that idea of you know, political parties having foot soldiers with guns is you know, is one that, you know, I suspect some of our people in our audience today might not be very familiar with. But there's also an ethnicity to it in Kirache, which sort of follows some of the main groups, which might be worth explaining to our audience. You know, we talk about the MQM, and you know, as a, you know, there are the party of the Muhajirs and so on. It might be worth just explaining that, just so people have a sort of basic grasp of that, those tensions right at the heart of the city.
Yeah, sure. So it kind of, I guess it goes back to Pakistan's formation, and Karachi is a real, it's because it was the capital at the time of partition. It's not anymore, but it's still the economic heart of the country, and it's a place where people go to sort of make their fortune, as it were. It's a place that's seen as having opportunity, and that means that all the different ethnic groups of Pakistan are there. And sort of that exponential rate of population increase means the infrastructure hasn't really kept pace. So there's quite a fierce competition for resources, whether that's land or water, or also political power, I guess. So that's the kind of underpinning of it. And the different ethnic groups, there's the Pashtuns from the north of the country, many of whom have come to Karachi as a result of either natural disasters or also violence there. That's where the kind of the worst overspill of the Afghan conflict has been, of various Afghan conflicts. And so people have often made their way south. There's also the Muhajirs, who you mentioned, who were the Urdu-speaking migrants who came from India at the time of partition, and most of them settled in Karachi. That caused a lot of resentment with the local population. The Sindhis, which is that's the province. Sindh is the province that Karachi sits in. And then you've also got people from Balochistan, which is the sort of neighbouring province, and that's where lots of people in Liari are from, Balochistan. And there's all these different tensions that have sort of erupted. I mean, soon after Pakistan's formation, there were language riots, the sort of anger with the Sindhi population, resentful that the Muhajirs, who were broadly quite educated, were taking the plum government jobs. There's a lot of tension between Muhajirs and Pashtuns, because the Muhajirs sort of see the Pashtuns as a later migrant population, are taking their sort of quite hard-won political power and so on, seeing them as a threat to their political dominance of the city. So there's all these different ethnic tensions really simmering, and lots of the political parties, most of the political parties really are sort of broadly ethnic in their character. So they're sort of, at least originally, were formed along sort of roughly ethnic lines. And that sort of underpins a lot of what sort of goes on in politics there. And then obviously you have lots of other complicated things coming into play, but I think that's really, that sort of ethnic, sort of ethno-nationalism is really important.
And that competition for scarce resources in the context of an exploding population and, you know, lack of services, expanding, you know, people building to make homes for themselves, you know, without, you know, we use the term unregulated areas, but essentially I think we mean areas with no sewage provision, no running water, no legal electricity supply a lot of the time. And in amongst all of that, you've got this wonderful chapter about this fellow Siraj, another social worker who's a map maker who's trying to help people build good houses to encourage the authorities to bring, all those services that we take for granted to these homes so that people can live with some kind of dignity. And he too, like all of our characters, comes up against serious obstacles from all of those institutions that we've spoken about, the political parties, organised crime, the government. Tell us a bit about that, because I think that tells us a lot about what living in a city, like a mega city, developing city like Karachi is actually like.
Yeah, so he's from an area called Wigtown, which sort of started as a big unplanned settlement, basically. So lots of people, this is a lot of people after the Bangladesh War in 1971 were displaced when Bangladesh separated from Pakistan and came to Karachi, and there wasn't really any provision for them. And a lot of them ended up settling there in Wigtown, just a sort of big sprawling area at the edge of the city, and they just sort of started building, and they weren't connected to any amenities, as you say. No sewage, no nothing. And there's some really pioneering work done in that area. There's an organisation called the Arangi Pilot Project, which was run by a social reformer and architect called Parveen Rahman, who was a mentor to Siraj. And so she sort of pioneered, the organisation pioneered these sort of low-cost community sewage systems where local communities pay in a really small amount and they get training on how to install pipes and so on. And it's now been exported to other parts of the world, so it's incredibly effective, obviously, in reducing avoidable deaths. They do a whole load of other work too, including, as you say, basically drawing maps of these areas that have sprung up completely organically, and then taking those maps to the municipal authorities and saying, look, these are the buildings that are here, these are the people that live here. You need to recognise this area and put it on your city plans, and that's then a first step. Once the area is sort of officially recognized and regularized, as you say, that's a first step to being able to get them an electricity supply and running water and all of these things. And so Siraj grew up in the area, was mentored by Parveen Rahman, and cares very, very passionately about doing this work on one particularly grim, for me, delightful for him, day of reporting. He took me on a tour of multiple different sewage systems in the area, which was not for the faint-hearted. He's really, really passionate about it. He kept saying, oh, let's just go and see this one more. This one's really poorly maintained. It's like, oh, God, in 40-degree heat. So
it's incredible because Pakistan actually invented sewerage systems at Mohenjo-daro. It's the most sort of sophisticated grid system of clean and sewage water system, 3,000 years old, but none of its modern cities or India's.
Well, this work they're doing, I mean, it's not glamorous at all, the work on the sewage, but it's incredibly impressive and effective. And I think the really striking thing about it is just, it seems like very worthy, not very exciting work, but it became really high stakes in the context of Karachi. So Parveen Rahman, who I mentioned was his mentor, this sort of pioneering architect and social activist, was murdered in 2013 as she was shot dead coming back from work one day. It's sort of thought that it was probably because of her work mapping areas. So it's either to do with water mafias or land mafias. So water mafias who illegally siphon off water from public hydrants and then sell tankers to people at extortionate rates. That's an incredibly lucrative business. And she did a big series, 2 reports she did about the sort of location of these hydrants and sort of really setting out how the water mafias functioned, and also land mafias, because they were going into lots of the further and further out these unregularized settlements and mapping them and getting them recognition. This was work that Siraj was doing with her as well. And that's not desirable for land mafias, who are often unscrupulous property developers, who it's quite convenient if the areas aren't regularized, because they can if the villagers or the sort of poor people who live on that area don't have any proof that they own the land and that it's there, that they live there, then it's very easy for someone to sort of kick them out and bulldoze it and build a much more lucrative development. So her work on one of those 2 areas got her killed, and Siraj is still working on this on this stuff, even after his mentor's death. So yeah, I think his story was really interesting. And as you say, even apart from that, just sort of navigating the different political parties, the MQM was very dominant in his area, and really having to sort of work around the constraints imposed by the party to just get his day-to-day work done.
Let's. It might be a good moment actually to just tee us up. Tell us a little bit about the chapter on Jannat, because that starts off as a very optimistic kind of story, and then like so many others, of stories you have of really well-intentioned, good people trying to make life better for people, coming up, being confronted by what corrupt power, really the brutality of corrupt power, I think. So tell us, just tee us up for that, and then read us that a section on from that chapter, and then I think we'll take a few questions from our audience.
Sure. So Jannat is a young woman who lives in a village at the edge of the city. It's a kind of urban rural settlement. It's the kind of place I went there and was amazed that it was still part of the city, because it really didn't feel like it. Like there's goats wandering around, and people only got electricity in the last few years, and it's very kind of rural. But they've lived there for hundreds of years, her family, her community. It's very, she's, as a woman, it's a very conservative area, doesn't really leave very much. She's basically interacted with the same 200 or so people for her whole life. And there's this very real kind of emotional connection to the land and to the soil. And their village is at threat from a new development. So as I just described, the sort of lots of places being sort of poor people who don't have much recourse to official protection, being forcibly removed from their land, which then sort of lucrative developments are built on, because the city is sort of expanding and expanding. So there's ever increasing demand for these, apartment blocks and so on. But where she lives, so they actually, they're not an unregularized area. They've been there for years and years, and they've got the kind of claim to the land. It's their ancestral land. But there's extraordinary development that's being built over the whole area, and it's already started. It hasn't quite expanded to her village yet, but they have they've sort of seen off a couple of attempts on it, literally men turning up with bulldozers and police officers as well, because it's all very sort of tied into the law enforcement as well. It's this enormous development called Barrier Town that's being built by one of the country's richest men, and it's planned to be the size of Washington DC, and it's sort of being built over this village land at the edge of the city. So this is a bit from the end of the book, where after spending lots of time in the sort of village and with Jannat and her community, I finally went to see the actual development and see what it was about. So I'll just read that. I drove to Barrier Town from downtown Karachi one morning, keen to get a sense of why so many people were drawn to it. The motorway was edged by a flat expanse of sandy, dry-looking earth, punctuated by petrol pumps, massive lorries, and rusting electricity pylons. We paid a toll to enter Barrier Town, a small fee, but enough to make the compound inaccessible for people like the Cachelos. The roads were noticeably smooth and free of potholes, edged by neatly trimmed hedges. Lush green lawns filled the spaces between intersections, an unusual sight in a city plagued by water shortages. The site was full of half-finished houses and apartment blocks. There were road signs pointing to the hospital, the cricket stadium, Sports City, Golf City, and Cinegold, the cinema complex. One roundabout bore a sculpture of two bears poised over a log, then another soon afterwards, an elephant. Signs everywhere urged you to keep Barrier clean. In the distance, gigantic plastic lettering reading "I Heart Barrier Town" loomed. Construction was still suspended, and although some people already lived there, much of it was empty or half-finished. It felt like stepping into a ghost town. As we drove, sometimes roads tapered off into nothingness, merging into the dusty scrubland of the villages beyond. My driver wasn't sure where we were and wanted to ask for directions, but we drove for more than 15 minutes before encountering anyone. "How hard is it to find a human round here?" he muttered. Eventually we came to the dancing fountain, a pool of water as large as a lake, sparkling in the sun, surrounded by floodlights. I looked at the complicated system of pipes and pumps designed to make the water spurt and dance during an event, and thought about Jannat, filling up jugs from the borehole, her arms aching when the power was off and she had to use the hand pump. We drove to the Eiffel Tower, which was partially constructed. It sat atop a mountain of sand, surrounded by steelworkers, sparks of welding flying from its joints, despite the fact that construction was halted. I stopped for a moment to stare at it, overwhelmed by the utter incongruity of a fake Eiffel Tower surrounded by freshly planted palm trees and piles of sand. The development stretched out as far as the eye could see, half-built roads that led nowhere dissolving into the sandy earth. It was so big already. It was unstoppable. The Supreme Court decision was reversed within a few months. In March 2019, it was agreed that Riaz would pay an immense sum, 460 billion rupees or 2.3 billion pounds to the court in return for being able to resume construction. Soon after the decision, I visited Lal Bakhsh Court. Given Jannat's obsession with my unmarried status, I was excited to share the news that I had got engaged since I saw her last. She clapped her hands in delight. Has your groom built you a house yet? Bushra wanted to know. It doesn't really work like that in London, I explained. We don't have a lot of space for new houses to get built. Don't worry, said Jannat, not missing a beat. There's a lot of space in Barrier Town. Why doesn't he build you one there? No one in Lal Bakhsh knew what was going to happen to them. They could not afford to rebuild their poultry farms, which sat there destroyed, the rubble disintegrating in the wind. In the few months that the construction was off, the machinery that bothered Jannat so much at night had been inactive. Now it was back, humming and beeping. When I visited, the dust stuck to my tongue and made my eyes itch. Jannat saw me wiping my phone screen and told me that this fine, persistent dust was because of the construction. The barrier bulldozers with their police escorts had not returned yet, but everyone in the village assumed that it was a matter of when, not if.
Wonderful, thank you. It's an incredible landscape that you've captured. You know, we've had, you know, suicide bombs or bomb attacks on Shia Muslim processions, Ashura. You know, hundreds of people killed, assassinations, encounter killings, the impunity of gangsters, the complicity with politicians, the criminalization of politics, and in amongst that, you've got these 5 people. Broadly, I mean, we don't. Maybe Zilly's motivations are not quite the same, but certainly the 4 others trying to change people's lives and do some good, and coming up against, you know, being frustrated at every turn by the reality of corrupt power in the city, but also, you know, it's in Pakistan as a whole. And you know, if a few people have asked, we've had a few questions in. Someone has asked, how bright is Karachi's future? And by extrapolation, that of Pakistan. Will the 20th century be kind to the country? Somebody else has asked about the ethnic distinctions and conflicts and whether they can be overcome. So there's quite a few questions around the idea of what hope is there for Pakistan, and in a way, I think that's encapsulated by your reading there. You know, that Jannat wants this modern life that, you know, that that she's aware of can be possible. You know, of having accessible hospitals, having schools that everybody, including girls, can go to and fulfill their ambitions. But yet somehow it's not for them. So it raises this question of who is Pakistan for, and implicit in that is our audience questions of, you know, what hope does that give the country and its people for the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. Some big questions there. Yeah, I think no, that's okay. That's fine. I think that there. I mean, I guess like so many countries, there is just this huge disparity between rich and poor. It's obviously an issue everywhere in the world, but I think particularly in a developing country. And, you know, you see that in very stark relief in an urban setting, and especially a big megacity that's expanded so quickly. And so it's kind of difficult, given that is an issue everywhere in the world, it's sort of difficult to be overly optimistic about that changing imminently, that sort of huge disparity, which is where I think a lot of the problems come from. I mean, certainly in Karachi, it sort of feels to me that the sort of wealthier are forced to pay for all their own services, and that means there's a sort of disengagement with the kind of civic in a way. So there isn't that kind of pressure for things to improve because you're sort of paying for all your own stuff anyway, your private electricity and water and so on. And so it kind of becomes even more disconnected from what the vast majority of people are going through. I mean, when I was living with relatives, I think I barely even knew that there was an electricity crisis because there was just constant power in the house because there was a private generator, and so on. And then you spend time, and actually lots of people in vast swathes of the city might have power for like 3 hours a day or something, if that. And so, yeah, I think that kind of, that's a long-winded way of saying that I think those kind of deep structural issues aren't going anywhere immediately, and we see this trend the world over that those divisions aren't getting any smaller. I think with somewhere like Pakistan, which is developing, if it's a lot safer now than it was, and I know the government's staking a lot on encouraging tourism and sort of.
We've got a question on that, Samira. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. But someone has asked, they're saying that I think Christine Chapman has said that she's due to go to Pakistan on a holiday in September, and that she hopes she's able to travel. And we spoke about this earlier on. This, we're talking a lot about how terrible this city is and how terrible this country is, and yet I think we probably both maybe agree that we've never found hospitality or kindness among people there quite like it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's extraordinarily.
People, tell us a bit about, maybe talk to our audience about, that there is a huge Pakistani heart that most people, where most other people around the world see only danger and fear.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily hospitable culture, extraordinarily so. And it's also, as I said, the book depicts a very particular moment, and I do think it's a lot safer now. And it was also particular to place. I mean, there's always been parts of the country that are a lot safer, and it's in many ways it's not an easy place to visit necessarily because the tourist infrastructure isn't there, because for many years international tourism hasn't really existed. But it's also an extraordinary place to visit. I mean, it's got incredible natural beauty and such a amazing culture of hospitality and warmth, as you say. And that's actually something I really wanted to get across in the book, although it does talk a lot about the violence and the ethnic conflict and so on. It also I did really want to show how sort of public spirited so many people are, and they really care about helping other people. And I think that's the people who I've written about in the book, I think, are all extraordinary in different ways, but they're also quite ordinary. I mean, there are so many people who are these sort of unsung heroes just trying to do things within whatever their means are to make things better for other people, for sure.
It's just a crying shame that the government and the political apparatus of the country that should be kind of nurturing them is stands in their way. But I guess it's not too uncommon in the region. But one of the things, kind of elephant in the room really, is that above all of this, all of these corrupt politicians and there's and their pet gangsters and so on, is another institution that we haven't spoke about. Although you do refer to it when you talk about the alliance that General Musharraf had when he seized power with the MQM, with Altaf Hussain, that the army is this sort of omnipotent, the most powerful institution in Pakistan, and to a huge extent, controls which politicians have any power at any given time. Maybe tell us a bit about that. Our audience may not be quite so familiar.
Yeah, the army's there's a sort of phrase that people say in Pakistan a lot, which is that most countries have an army, but in Pakistan, the army has a country. And that's actually, I was going to say that earlier when we were talking about the sort of prospects for the future. I mean, the army has such a dominance on public life that it's sort of difficult to see very significant change happening without a sort of shift in the balance of power. And I'm not quite sure what would make that shift happen. But yeah, it's an extraordinarily powerful institution, and I think has become more so. I mean, Pakistan spent almost half its half the time it's existed under direct military rule, and now they haven't staged a coup, but they're sort of during Imran Khan's government really sort of widely acknowledged to be the real sort of power brokers. So they've really been, they always retain power over certain aspects of policy. So yeah, it's an extremely powerful institution.
And rumours too that they may now be fed up with Imran Khan, having supported him before.
Yeah, although I think that they're in quite a good position now because he won. He sort of made it quite clear in his election campaign in 2018 that he was very happy to. He was very pro-army, but also he won with a paper-thin majority, which is sort of the best for the army because it's a weak. And so they like civilian institutions to be weak, which is also what makes it difficult to kind of have real wholesale change. Although, as I show in the book, and I think there's much more of this happening. There's a sort of there is great sort of grassroots change and great organizations and people doing stuff, but that kind of wholesale big change is very difficult to achieve when you have an incredibly powerful institution that's got a vested interest in keeping institutions weak.
Absolutely. It is an absolutely terrific book, and as I said, I think I said at the outset, it's rare in that you so seldom hear the story of Pakistan through the voices of its own ordinary and poorest people. It's a story that's more often than not told by the rich and powerful who have, interest in it remaining as frustrated and hamstrung as it is. So I strongly urge you all to go out and buy Samira's book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Thank you, Samira. Just before we go, I just want to say, to thank you on behalf of Wigtown. I made a mistake, actually. I think I said earlier on this was the last of the Wigtown Wednesdays, and that's not true. I think we have another one. I don't know if you saw it there in messages, but I think there's another one in April. So if you check the messages on this chat, there's another one in April. The other thing to say is that we need book festivals like Wigtown. It's a sensational institution. It's the most intimate book festival that I've ever been to. I absolutely love it. And hopefully we'll get a chance to all be there again in the autumn. Today's event and Samira's time it's a free event, and but as I say, it's very important to support these events and make it possible for writers like Samira to have to be able to talk about their books, so that we can go out and buy them. So if you are able to donate, there is a link on the chat panel on the side there. So I'd urge you to do that if you can. But in the meantime, I want to say to Samira, thanks hugely for sparing the time to talk to us about the book. It's a wonderful book. Wish you every success with it. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and hope to see you at the next Wigtown Wednesday in April. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.